In our last video, we told the story of a boy who followed his teacher deep into the mountains of Tibet, into a cave lit by spheres of cold light, filled with objects that should not exist, where only 7 monks in each generation were ever allowed to enter. But this was not the only account that Lobsang Rampa left behind. In 1971, he published another book. In it, he described a man who lost everything and was taken by something to a place far beyond the world he knew. The book was called The Hermit, and what he described was believed by millions and dismissed by just as many. But science is only now beginning to attempt it, and not even close to what the book describes. Somewhere in the mountains of Tibet, a vulture made slow circles in the air. It was following something. Below, on the gray rock, a figure moved. Then the bird began to descend, each circle tighter than the last, closer to the ridge, closer to the ground. The figure below grew clearer, a man. His robe caught the wind and pressed against a body that had very little left to it. He was climbing, but not like a man who knows where he is going. A wooden staff reached ahead, tapped twice, and only then did the foot follow. His free hand never left the rock, always touching, always feeling for what came next. He stopped at a patch of dry grass between the stones, pulled it, chewed it slowly as he moved. Further on, his fingers found a low branch, stripped the bark, and brought the soft white layer underneath to his mouth. When the sound of water reached him, he lowered himself to the ground, carefully, and pressed his face to it. At night, he folded himself into crevices in the rock and did not move until morning. Days passed. The distance between his steps grew shorter. His body folded closer to the ground with every ridge he crossed. Snow began to appear between the rocks, thin at first, then thicker, until it covered everything beneath his feet. Then, without knowing when it happened, the ground beneath him changed. The rock was no longer rising. It was flat, wide, open. His hand reached to the side and found nothing. No rock, no wall, just empty air. There was nothing left around him. And he kept walking. Then, the staff hit something smooth and hard. It rang when the wood struck it. His hands moved across the surface, left, then right. No crack, no edge, no end. It was huge. His legs gave out as if the last of his strength had simply left him. He collapsed. The air around him was warm, not from the sun, not from fire. Warm the way no air on the mountain should be. From somewhere above him, something moved, large, much larger than the man. It bent down and lifted him the way one lifts a child. Then it turned and carried him through what looked like an opening in the wall. Impossibly large. And then he was gone. But some time ago, far below the mountains, into a valley where the river bends, there was a city known for the many monasteries at its gates, for the smell of butter lamps that passed through stone walls, for the golden rooftops that lined the valley like a crown. Its name was Lhasa. In one of them, a boy, with a normal life, left there by his parents since he was small, as was the custom in those times. He sat cross-legged in rows with other boys, reciting words he could not yet make sense of. It did not matter. The words themselves were enough. He copied them, page after page, not because he was told to, but because he offered to. The feel of ink, the weight of parchment, the quiet of a room where nothing existed but letters and light. In time, they became his world. And later, his task became carrying papers between the Potala and the monasteries below. The same walk every day, the same silence. Then the city changed. There were new faces on the streets, uniforms he had not seen before, men who did not bow at the monastery gates, men who walked through the city as if it already belonged to them. He did not understand what was happening. He was a monk. These things were not his concern. Until the day he was seen leaving the Potala with papers in his hands. That was enough. They took him from the street in the middle of the day. No warning, no explanation. Just hands on his arms and a door that closed behind him. A room with no windows. The only light came from a candle placed on a table in the center. And through that light, at the far end of the table, two men. They asked questions. The same questions, again and again and again. Questions he could not answer, because there was nothing to answer. The papers held no secrets. He was a messenger, nothing more. But the men at that table did not believe him. What followed came slowly, not all at once. It built the way cold builds, quiet, steady, and then total. Each day the same room, the same candle, the same questions. And when the answers did not change, the methods did. His body was broken in stages, methodically, without urgency, as if the men at the table had all the time in the world and he was the only one who did not. He told them everything he knew. It was not enough. He told them again. It was never enough. Because what they wanted, he did not have. And what he had, the truth, they did not want. Then, one day, the questions stopped. A hand reached toward his face. And then, his eyes hit the floor. He woke up. For the first time since the darkness took him, he looked upon a human being. It was himself, lying on a smooth white surface held up by a single pillar rising from the floor. But beneath him, something soft, softer than wool, softer than anything in the monasteries. He had no word for it. He had slept on stone his whole life, on cold floors, on frozen ground, in crevices of rock. He had never felt anything like it. And across his body, things he had never seen before. Around the eyes, a white dressing, clean and tight, whiter than anything he had ever worn. Below it, a cord entered through his nostril and disappeared down into his throat. On his arm, a strap coiled tight around the skin. Beside him, a clear box stood on a tall stem. Inside it, a pale gold liquid. A white sheet covered him from the chest down, thin and smooth, nothing like the rough cloth of his robes. Past the edge of the sheet, near his ankle, another cord. It led to a second box, the color of tree sap. On one finger, something small held on tight. It seemed alive. It had a single red eye. It blinked without stop. On the wall beside him, small round windows covered in glass. Behind each one, faint lines moved, up and down, without stopping. It all meant nothing to him. And from his forehead, sharp, thin shapes pushed straight into the bone of his skull, each one connected by a thread leading directly to the place he was seeing from. Then the view shifted, fast, to the left. He had nothing to do with that. Something taller than two monks standing on each other's shoulders, in a greenish robe. The head shaped like an egg, completely without hair. The arms hung too low. The hands were covered in something like the film on boiled milk. It was bent over a long, flat table. On the table, a creature, larger than any dog he had ever seen, but with no fur and limbs that did not belong to any animal he knew. Behind it, more tables. Each one held something different, shapes the boy had never seen in Tibet. Then the view moved further. A forest had grown inside the room. Tall plants rising straight from the floor with leaves that gave off their own light. Some glowed soft blue, others pale purple, others still a color he could not name. A woman walked between them. Her skin was so dark, light itself could not reach it. Hair tight against the skull, curled, close. She moved slowly, touching the leaves as she passed. The leaves leaned toward her hand. The view turned again. Another woman, almost white, straight hair falling past the shoulders like thread. In front of her, stones floated in the air, each at its own height. Not stones from any mountain the boy had ever crossed. One shone from within. Another turned slowly, as if caught in a wind no one could feel. Another had a color he had never seen before, and from it rose a thin light, like smoke rising on its own. The woman walked between them, stopping at each one, watching. She studied them the way a monk studies a sacred text. Then, in the far reaches of the room, away from the others, the smallest body, but with the largest head he had ever seen. A smooth, round dome that seemed far too heavy for the frame beneath. The chin was small. The mouth was not a mouth. It was a triangular opening. Where a nose should be, only a ridge. And the eyes were open, dark, unblinking. They looked at nothing and everything at once. This one had no table, no specimens, no work, just watching. The view shifted again, as if he were in the arms of an Indian from the markets of Lhasa. Something was strange. He was very close to him. Then he moved back and sat on something that looked like the table the boy was lying on. He took out of his coat something like a piece of glass. He saw a small black box with thin wires running out of it, and beside it, himself, lying still. No cords, only the white cloth over his eyes and the rods in his head. The Indian man looked at him for a moment, and he began to speak in a voice the monk could understand. He told him that they had been waiting, not days, not weeks. They had known he was coming long before the Chinese took him from the street, long before the questions, long before he was left without sight. They had watched him for years, a monk with no rank and no title. but with a memory that held everything it saw, every word, every face, every page he had looked at without giving it a second thought. A memory that does not fade. That was why he had been chosen. Not for strength, not for wisdom, for the one thing no machine on earth could replace: the ability to remember and to pass it on. He said nothing more about it, and the monk did not ask. Then the doctor began to explain what they had done to him. He started with the optic nerve. Still alive, he said, still intact, running from the empty sockets deep into the brain. That was why they could help him see again. The pathway was damaged, but not dead. The skull was opened along 5 precise lines to reach the visual cortex, the part of the brain that builds the image. It was untouched. The bone was lifted gently on a hinge of skin because the tissue beneath could not be exposed to pressure or contamination. Then the electrodes were placed directly onto the surface of the brain, thin enough not to damage the synaptic pathways that were still active, still carrying signal, waiting for input that would never come from the eyes. They were connected to the sight box through what remained of the optic nerve, because the bioelectric pattern it once carried could be replicated, rerouted, fed from an external source instead of an internal one. A neural interface was built between the device and the cortex so the brain could learn to read a new kind of signal, the way a river finds a new path when the old one is blocked. He described it calmly, precisely, the way a man describes the building of a bridge. The monk understood none of it. Not the words, not the methods, not a single thing the doctor described. Except the last thing he said. A name. Simple, clear. The only words in the room that felt like they belonged to his world. The gardeners of the earth. That is what they called themselves. What they gave him, he would carry in silence for the rest of his life. That is what the book describes. A man with no eyes, given sight through a machine. That is what this book described in 1971. The idea itself was not entirely new. In 1968, British neuroscientist Giles Brindley demonstrated that electrical stimulation of the visual cortex could create flashes of light in blind patients. A few years later, William Dobell continued that work, attempting to restore vision through direct stimulation of the brain. But those early systems were primitive, flashes of light, simple patterns, nothing like the system described in the story. In 2013, Argus 2 became the first retinal prosthesis approved for clinical use in the United States. A camera mounted on a pair of glasses transmitted images to electrodes implanted in the retina, allowing some blind patients to perceive shapes, movement, and light. In 2024, Neuralink received FDA Breakthrough Device designation for blind sight. Instead of working through the eye, the system aims to send visual information directly into the visual cortex through implanted electrodes. The monk in this story described a black box, metal rods protruding from his head, and a way of seeing after his eyes were gone. In 1968, researchers could create flashes of light. More than half a century later, they are still trying to create the kind of sight described in this book. Perhaps it was all imagined, or just for the sake of a story, for the sake of letting the mind run free. A story in which a man was taken onto something like a vessel that later left the earth, leaving the vulture without its prey, still circling above the rock. Make of that what you will. This has been The Void Archives. Subscribe, because the deeper we dig, the stranger it gets.